If you're a leader in a business and you are running an organisation, it's likely that 20% of your employees are going to be neurodivergent, 20% of your customers, 20% of your clients, 20% of your family, 20% of your friends. So if you are not thinking about those people, you are ignoring a significant sector of people that you should be working with and thinking about.
I'm Hattie Willis, your host, and each episode I talk to an entrepreneur, investor, or startup expert to unpack their hardest moments, biggest wins, and hard-earned advice so we can shortcut our learnings as founders together. So, today I'm joined by the brilliant Sasha Evans. Sasha has had a beautifully squiggly career, as we were just discussing. I'm going to try and get the order right. I already know we got the order wrong. So we did theatre.
Yeah.
Then I've already forgotten the next step.
Experience design,
then education, and then startups.
Yes.
And one of the things that Sasha and I have been talking a ton about recently, because Sasha has actually been really helping me in my business Guessworks, is around how do we design for neuro inclusivity when we're thinking about supporting entrepreneurs, because there is a ton of stuff that just gets harder, but also entrepreneurs are much more likely to be neurodiverse.
Yeah.
So we're going to dive into a ton of practical tips for if you're a founder with autism, ADHD. I want to explore some of the things that might help us.
Yeah.
But also how founders who are even neurotypical might want to think about how they're designing experiences, because you almost certainly will have neurodiverse customers, stakeholders, and we need to think about them. And it's been fascinating for me because Sasha's also come and delivered some of our workshops and training for Guessworks for schools. And I've been learning a ton, I think, from Sasha going through our materials and saying, hey, this isn't helpful about what helps me. So hopefully it's going to be, not hopefully, it is going to be brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
For all founders, whether you're neurotypical or whether you're neurodiverse, or as I suspect, actually, maybe even a higher proportion will be wondering where you might sit on the neurotypical to neurodiverse spectrum. And one other thing we're going to talk about is...
This sounds mysterious, Hattie.
You're going to love it. Sasha has a brilliant series on LinkedIn. I'm going to paraphrase, but basically ask me anything about neurodiversity and I won't get offended.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really good thing. I want to get into some of the questions you've been asked and some of the things you think people are just scared to ask and would love to know. So maybe we can start from the perspective of your journey into entrepreneurship specifically and what you thought it was going to be versus what it was.
Oh my God. I don't even know where to start with that, because I think my understanding of what being an entrepreneur was versus the reality of it is so utterly different. I've always done entrepreneurial things, right? So I left school at 18. I didn't go to university. I just kind of have done loads and loads of different stuff. And I always felt that I was the person that was trying to change things in organisations or always trying to do something different. And I've done all sorts of different things. And then when COVID happened, I had a kind of moment of going, what am I doing? What's my purpose? What's my reason? And I saw a sort of advert from Zinc who were looking for entrepreneurs to join their program, their cohort, and I applied and got onto that program. And I think it was within 2 weeks of being on the Zinc program, I went, holy cow, this is so different from what I thought it was going to be.
And for anyone who doesn't know, Zinc is a venture builder. So you can go in very much focused on who are the people, and then you go in and they have a process to help you come up with ideas. They have areas that they want you to innovate within. Zinc is a very impact-oriented venture builder. Okay, so what were some of those shocks?
So the shocks were, first of all, that there is a massive problem within the sort of startup space around diversity, right? But one of the reasons for that is that if you're going to go into the type of business that is around raising investment, which is what Zinc does and what all the Excel accelerators are generally kind of focused on, you have to be able to support yourself financially for a period of time. And that is a huge barrier for many overlooked founders. I just didn't quite appreciate that at the beginning. And I think it's a massive problem and a massive barrier and a structural sort of issue that we're not talking about enough. I went in thinking I can build a business, and after a very short period of time I was like, oh wow, that means I'm not going to earn any money for 2 years or beyond. And there's that sort of changes your way of thinking. I think the other thing is that in that particular environment, the pace and speed that you need to work at, which is for an ADHD, is like thrilling and great, but also trying to design in those moments of thoughtfulness, of creativity is really hard when you're in that kind of startup-y bubble.
We can end up doing so much that we're actually not giving ourselves the creative time. I see that so much.
Yeah, it's really common, isn't it? I hadn't quite realised how much of that I was sort of getting into.
And so you go through the process with Sync. Anything you think founders thinking about doing a venture builder should be aware of? Because I think for lots of people, it's one way into entrepreneurship, right? When you don't have an idea, and that can be really compelling, but it's quite hard to know before you go on one what it's going to be like. And they're all really different, just to be clear, like you need to do research on them, but anything at a broad level about being on a venture builder?
So I would say, I think Zinc have changed their criteria now, which means that you go in with a business.
Okay.
When I was doing it, you went in as an individual, you weren't allowed to have that business. But I think the biggest thing that I wish I had understood more, and I saw it within the cohort that I was in as well, is that you are there to build a scalable business. And people's understanding of scale in this, if you don't understand the VC world, is like completely different. So what might be scalable, for example, for a therapist who is running a number of practices is completely different from a SaaS company that is scaling at that level. And that's the biggest thing. Like, go into that if you want to scale at the speed, probably tech focused, and that's the type of product that you want to be doing. If you want to have a business that is going to bring in £500,000 revenue a year and be a great business that will support a lot of people and help a lot of people, really think about whether that's the right thing that you should be doing.
So important for founders to hear, because all of these things will put you on a path. And if that's the path you want, that's a real leg up onto the path. But if it's not the path you want, it's not going to be the right stuck on it, really.
100%. The sector is very geared towards hero worshipping, the kind of VC-backed model. And there are some brilliant companies that I know that are doing great work and impact work and have VC funding, and it enables a lot. But it's the percentage of companies that actually attract that VC funding is so tiny. There's a million other ways to build a business that can still have impact, can still create revenues, can still scale. It's just that we hold this model up as one version of doing it. And I think that is one of the reasons that we're seeing a lack of diversity, because it's one way to build a company that doesn't work for everybody.
100%. And I think you're also right. And I'm always divided when we do interviews, because you're an incredible founder in your own right, and I do want to spend time on your journey. But I think actually what's most useful for listeners at this point is going to be to get into the nitty-gritty of firstly, what actually is ADHD and autism. Because I think for a lot of us, and really personally, we've talked a lot about, and I think I've talked about it on the podcast before, but for anyone who's kind of new or hasn't heard maybe a specific episode where I do, I'm someone who realised I had ADHD very late. I, at school, thought ADHD was, could you sit still in a classroom? And did you perform well? And I was always a very strong academic. I never struggled in school. I was really lucky to be getting scholarships and things. So I was never on anyone's radar. But increasingly realised, and it was a classic, I think it was lockdown, was watching Modern Family. They're a family, shockingly, lots of families are Modern Family, but one of them, for anyone who has watched, Phil and his son Luke, and the mum of the family is beautiful. And the mum of the family is worried that her son, Luke, has ADHD. And so she's discussing with someone else on the programme the characteristics of ADHD. But rather than cutting to her son, it cuts to her husband for every part of it, right? And so they're going through all of these moments of Phil trying to complete a task in the garage. And he's doing one thing, getting distracted, risk-taking in peril, he's suddenly climbing all over. And all of these things I actually never thought I had. I was suddenly looking at my boyfriend was looking on the sofa and just kept turning to me and going, eyebrows raised. Basically, it's you. And I thought, what? And it just hadn't ever crossed my mind until watching that one. And since then, I think it's exploded on social media and there's much more awareness around it. But I've spoken to a lot of founders, particularly female founders, because I think we were slightly sold just the male diagnosis a few years ago. lots of female founders realizing they have it and then going through a process of trying to work out what on earth that means. And I think it's quite tricky when you're older to work out what this means. So can we just get started on what are some of the common traits of ADHD? How might that show up, especially in entrepreneurs, in ways that are helpful and unhelpful?
Yeah. So it's really interesting because, so I am ADHD, really similar to you, had a diagnosis very late on in my career, in my life, and also had that kind of moment, which is really common for people who get a diagnosis or people who suspect, where you look back on your life and you go, oh my God, and stuff starts clicking into place. And it's this sort of light bulb, people describe it as a light bulb moment, but it's also tinged with this sense of sadness because what could have been, those two things jut up against each other because you know that you've got this kind of explanation for your life, but at the same time, most people with ADHD would have been through some sort of trauma or will have had like there's a lot of the crossover between neurodivergence, autism, ADHD, all the other conditions and mental health is that they're kind of connected, or at least there's a kind of crossover. And that is often because we're living in a world that isn't designed for us. Yeah. There are mental health problems that come from that, and you can look at that and it's a real kind of tension. So I have worked with a lot of neurodivergent people. I have worked in companies with mainly neurodivergent people. I've run neurodivergent teams. I've led neurodivergent businesses. I've worked with neurodivergent customers. I've worked with hundreds of neurodivergent families. So I've really got this sort of understanding of it. And the position I'm coming in now in terms of ADHD and autism is that there is way more crossover in traits between all of the neurodivergences than people we actually might have thought about previously. So when I'm talking to people about neurodivergence and what does ADHD look like and what does autism look like, that's based on a really medical model. You go and you get a diagnosis because there's something that's sort of perceived to be wrong with you, right? And what I'm starting to think about a lot more, and I've talked to people about, is the common traits that those different diagnoses exhibit. Because if you recognise that there's a crossover in those traits, which there absolutely is, you can start to think about it a little bit differently. With all neurodivergent conditions, there is sort of three similar things that people tend to struggle with. The first is around executive functioning. And what that means is your ability to organise and sort of live your everyday life. So that is something that people with ADHD will really struggle with. It's the reason why I can put on a West End show, but I can't read a map.
So I've not had a formal diagnosis, but I went through a process to access something called Access to Work, which is an exceptional resource if you're in the UK. Really recommend it. Basically, support from the government in lots of ways, one of which for me has been ADHD coaching, which has been transformative, and a support worker, which is incredible, and practical stuff like equipment. So massive plug for that. It's an incredible scheme. Access it. It's massively underdrawn on. They have money each year than they can spend at the moment. So please keep using it so they keep allocating resource to it.
Yeah. There's a massive waiting list for it at the moment, just so people know.
There is, it's about
it's worth it when
2 to 3 months, but it really is thousands of pounds sometimes to support a year and incredible. And there was a company I used, which this is not an ad for, but I found really helpful, called Head Stuff, who helped me prepare what to ask for. Because I was like, I've not had a diagnosis, I don't know what I need. One of the things I found fascinating going through that process was they would say, do you struggle with executive function? And I would go, no, like, to be a project manager, I can be incredibly organised. And then they go through, do you ever find yourself forgetting to eat a meal? Oh, like 2-3 times a week. Yeah. I spent an entire ADHD coaching session on how to make sure I have breakfast. Yeah. Some really basic stuff that I just was so used to. And you also get so used to masking things even to yourself. Oh, yeah, I do that. But actually, what do I have to have in place to make sure I do that? Because I really don't do that otherwise. And I think for a lot of these things with ADHD, especially if you're coming into it, and I'm sure with autism, if you're coming to it later in life, by that point, you've had to come up with some coping mechanisms. So it might be a teasing out process of, what do I find really hard?
Exactly. And I think this is the issue, is that the masking becomes so ingrained in us. It's so hard to know what is you and what is learnt behaviour. So typically something that does go wrong with diagnosis, particularly around ADHD, is that the questions that you're asked in diagnosis are things like, do you feel you're compelled and driven by a motor? Or do you feel that it's difficult to sit down in meetings? Now, I don't feel driven. That is not a description I've used of myself, driven by a motor. But if someone said to me, do you feel that you just work and don't quite know when to stop? That does describe me. Do I get up and walk out of meetings? No, I don't. But am I resisting the urge to do that? Quite often. And so the wording of it is really problematic.
I think it's worth just noting that it might take some time to kind of notice these things, right?
Yeah.
I was talking to someone the other day about, I often don't think I fidget. If you rewatch any of these videos, you're probably like, how do you fidget all the time? But I had a friend come around, one of my best friends the other evening, and we're having a conversation, sat on the sofa. And after a while, she said, I'm really enjoying that you've had 4 hairstyles while we've been having this chat. It was like a 10-minute chat. And I'd had a ponytail, I'd had a side plait. And when I first started dating my boyfriend, I remember him just being like, please, can you sit down? And I was like, but I've seen, I need to water that plant. But in meetings and in school, I've never struggled with that. And I don't even find it hard, right? But in my relaxed day to day,
exactly,
where I'm not actively thinking about it.
Yeah. And that's because in those environments, you've been taught how to behave, and there is a punishment if you don't behave in that way, or so on. Like, it's exactly the same. And people talk about stimming. Okay, so stimming is a repetitive behaviour that was traditionally associated with people who are autistic, that is a kind of regulating. So typically, if you see someone rocking, or if you see someone moving their hand a particular way. Exactly. Now, I think stimming is super common with people in ADHD. It's a way that we regulate. I do exactly the same as you. I'm constantly fiddling with my hair. I'm constantly doing this. I'm moving these types of things all the time. Like you're talking like the sort of the rubbing. Yeah, exactly. Itchy nose.
The one a friend of mine recently
with my nails.
Always like moving my nail fingers, through every nail on top, underneath.
Yeah. But that's the thing. That is doing a...
Now
I just started doing it. Exactly. That's a new one. I might try that.
Yeah, it's really
but this impulse we have to move is something that we need, right? And it's not like you're standing up, you're going to the sofa and you go, I'm going to stand up now. You're seeing something that's important and you need to go and get it, and therefore you stand up and go and do it. But other people wouldn't necessarily know that, or they might go, I'll deal with that later, or so on. But it is doing a good thing for us. And there's this whole link, I believe, between kind of movement and thinking and creative processing, which is underexplored, but dancers understand it, right? The relationship between movement and learning. It's why we teach kids phonetics by going A, answer my arm, which is what they teach them in primary school in like reception class, because it's that movement that is getting stuff in, and it helps us.
And one of the things I actually found really helpful practically in ADHD coaching, which might be useful for some people, was to go through an exercise of looking at, and you can kind of Google processing modalities.
Yeah.
And there are different, I think there's like 8 or 9. There's quite a few of them. And sitting and thinking, where do I rank these? Yeah. And kinesthetics, so movement and environment is one of them. And I was chatting to my ADHD coach recently and realised actually that's much higher on my list than I thought it was.
Yeah.
Right? The way I talk, and even little things like if I go for a walk with a friend, so much more focused.
Yeah.
Except until I see a dog, and then,
Then the dog takes it. Of course, it's a dog.
And this is going to be the most hilarious podcast episode I've ever done. 2 very ADHD women.
Just like going, let's start a conversation about dogs now.
Yeah,
just try that,
And what's your favourite breed?
Yeah, lurcher. Anyway.
I love it. Oh,
just that we're thinking of getting a lurcher.
Oh, very cute. Okay, don't get distracted.
Sure.
So, I love it. And I think actually just on the stimming piece, I guess I wanted to make the point, because one of the things that you flagged to me before I was going and teaching in schools was actually if you spot a student doodling, and I think it applies to if you spot someone in a meeting doodling that looks like it's doing nothing to do with the workshop. If you spot someone doing that kind of real fidgeting, doesn't mean you haven't got their attention.
Exactly.
And I think that's really helpful for people managing teams who are going, I'm struggling, they don't seem engaged.
Yeah.
That might not be the signal you think it is.
Exactly, because we have been taught that concentrating or listening requires eye contact and stillness, and it's not true. So when I was working with kids, and we were working with a lot of kids who obviously were neurodivergent, but a lot of them had sort of mental health issues that meant that they were not able to leave the house, they weren't going into school regularly. It was often kids who were having really extreme reactions to the world around them. And when we worked with them, we were working with them online, we let them do what they wanted when they were learning. So we had kids hanging on swings like upside down. We had some young people doing circuits, and it's just allowing that stuff to do it is doing something. That learning, it's doing something for us. And the fact that schools are set up in Victorian environments that were built for getting people better to work in factories, and stillness is become the thing, and how we expect people to play in office spaces and so on. But actually, we've lost that playfulness.
Spaces are like an absolute nightmare for ADHD. And I want to be careful because it's much easier for me to talk about ADHD because I have some personal experience to draw on. But I do want to talk about autism as well. And so we were going through the kind of 3 traits.
So there is research that's been done by a woman called Amanda Kirby, who runs an organisation called Do It Profiler, and she has collected a really great data set on self-reported traits of neurodivergent people. And what she has found is there are common traits that exist across all neurodivergences that are common regardless of your diagnosis or however you identify. There are kind of 3 main areas, and you can look her research up online. And the first is around executive function. The second is around sensory processing. So sensory processing meaning how we perceive and respond to the world. So is that light bright? Is that sound loud? And so on. But the thing that happens with sensory processing, typically, most often it's an auditory processing with people who are autistic, but also ADHD as well, is that we are taking in so much information around us. It's not that we have necessarily bad hearing, but we are taking so much information, but our ability to be able to prioritise that information is limited. So it's the reason why someone who is ADHD can go to a festival and do a 48-hour stint with really loud music and have the best time, but may struggle in an office when they're trying to concentrate on something and there's music playing. It's just to do with the environment and the task that you're trying to do at that time. So the kind of sensory processing, it's why people wear headphones or sunglasses or so on. It's because the world is often just way, way more complex and it's harder to sift out certain pieces of information. And then the third area is kind of around emotional regulation. So it's our ability to manage and respond appropriately to situations. Now, I would question what appropriate means in that scenario, but it means that we are more prone to depression and anxiety. But it also means, particularly with ADHD, the impulsive behaviour, because it's giving you a kind of an amazing hit when that happens, and we feel that more intensely. It's really interesting. But what it also means is that we feel things so deeply and we get so much joy from stuff as well. So if you can manage it in a way that means that you can have sensory experiences that give you joy, that is like a massive factor in just mental health and just general happiness.
And I think there's so much on this where I think it's important to be really explicit that a lot of the challenges, because everything is designed assuming that you don't have any of these things.
Yeah.
And I think I wanted to get your perspective because it's something I often face, because I think the number one trait of someone with ADHD is that they go and diagnose everyone around them with ADHD.
It's what happens. Hey, you get ADHD and all of a sudden
everyone has it. But I was chatting to someone in my life who I would say probably has a lot of very similar traits to me.
Yeah.
And I was saying to him, I think you might have these things. This is definitely an ADHD trait. And his kind of pushback was like, okay, but doesn't everyone just have ADHD then? And I get this question a lot, right?
Yeah.
But actually, couldn't everyone have it to a degree? And I think there's also this point of spectrums, which I think people get quite confused by. It's like, you know, autism, are we all on the spectrum?
Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Because I feel like for some people listening, they're going to be like, okay, but isn't that everyone? Or like, does this undermine it? Is it actually a thing?
So in order to meet the diagnostic criteria for autism, ADHD, those things have to have like a significant impact on your life. So you can, as a person, have autistic traits or have ADHD traits and not be autistic or ADHD. You have to meet certain criteria in order to get a diagnosis. And that's just the way that it works. People who are autistic or ADHD or neurodivergent, because obviously there's all sorts of different neurodivergents, but mostly people want to talk about kind of autism.
Oh, the neurodivergent.
Yeah, so you've got autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, which is around movement, dyscalculia. Yeah.
Can I ask about dyspraxia?
Yeah.
Because I feel like there's a bit of ADHD, which is you're really clumsy, right?
Yeah.
And I'm really always curious. I'm like, is that dyspraxia? Is that just part of ADHD?
Yeah. So a lot of people who are ADHD have, okay, right. Here we go. This is the hit, and here starts the lesson.
Coming up.
The hands are up, the lesson is starting.
Oh.
So a lot of people think we have 5 senses. We've actually got 7. Actually, there's a whole bunch of people that think we have more. But the 2 senses 8. The 3 senses we don't talk about very much are proprioception interoception, and a third one I can't remember now because it's ADHD. I've got ADHD. So the two I'm going to talk to you at the moment are proprioception and interoception. So interoception is our ability to read the signals that our body tells us. So it's why you don't eat, you forget to eat.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's why some people might forget to go to the, like, oh God, I really need to go to the toilet really now, or like might feel pain differently. So people who are neurodivergent often have bad interoception.
Yeah.
And you can teach yourself better interoception.
Yeah.
But it also has a very big link to mental health, because if you are tired and you can't tell, if you're hungry and you can't tell, and you might have hurt yourself but you're not really sure where it hurts or whatever, that all has an impact on mental health, right? So interoception is a really important thing. When I was working with young people, we would teach interoceptive skills. The other is proprioception, which is where you are in space. So if you are aware of where your body is in relation to other people, to this microphone, to this plant, to the door. Typically, we have bad proprioception as well, which means we bump into things.
And put things down with loads of force.
Yeah, exactly. I had this awful moment where I just bump into things all the time. I get bruised, and someone said to me, "You've got a lot of bruises. Are you okay?" And I was like,
great that they checked.
It was so good that they checked, and obviously they were checking that I was safe, and I was like, I am absolutely fine. I just am very clumsy. And so it's just a thing that happens, and that is very common with ADHD. Now, in order to have a dyspraxia diagnosis, you have to meet certain criteria, but it's that same thing, that you can still exhibit some of those traits without maybe reaching the diagnostic label. But this is the thing. This is why the medical model of diagnosis absolutely is one thing, but we need to be thinking about commonality of traits and neurodivergence as a whole, because there is so much crossover. And you have people who have 4 or 5 different diagnoses, who might have OCD, who might have ADHD, who might be autistic. And if you are one diagnosis, the chances of you also being, for example, if you've got ADHD, the chances of you being autistic or dyslexic are just so much more increased.
Yeah.
So actually what we need to get to is a point where we go, who are you? What do you need?
Yeah.
What's the stuff that works for you? And design stuff around that basis.
And I think one thing that struck me working with you is how much of the things that change to support a particular trait actually help everyone.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about this. You'd make a suggestion and I'd be like, well, that's just better. That's just clearer. It's just great.
Yeah, it works.
It doesn't matter actually if you have ADHD
Exactly.
or autism. This will make your learning experience more enjoyable, effective.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've added in dyslexia, dyspraxia.
Dyscalculia, DLD.
What's DLD?
Is what dyspraxia used to be called. Developmental learning disorder, I think. There's a whole discussion happening within the neurodivergent community at the moment about what is counted and what isn't, right? And you'll see this a lot with language, is that people argue with each other about, do you say neurodiverse or do you say neurodivergent or do you say neurotype? Do you say minority or whatever? The reason that this is happening is because the whole concept is so new. We weren't really talking about this pre-COVID, right?
Yeah.
So you have to let these discussions play out. And I really liken it as to similar to what happened with the gay rights movements in the 80s, is that the whole neurodiversity movement started with autistic rights, with people going, I'm advocating for myself, I'm fed up of the world not working for me, I'm proud to be autistic. And this moved into a kind of social movement. So in the same way that gay rights movements in the 80s moved into the kind of LGBTQ and then came sort of queer movement, it's the similar thing that's happening now. And that's why there's these complexities around language. And this is a social model. The concept of neurodiversity is a social model that exists outside of kind of medical diagnoses.
And it is just so much more common in founders. And we had a really interesting chat with Felicity in one of our previous episodes, who is a founder who's talked openly about her, again, late diagnosis. She was diagnosed with autism and ADHD. Actually, autism because she got the ADHD diagnosis first. And in that process, also got the autism diagnosis. One of the things she talks about is exactly as you said, that kind of combined grief. But also this, one of the things she often gets told is, and we talked about it in the episode, oh, but you don't seem autistic. Yeah. And then she's like, but you're basically saying you enjoy me masking it so you don't have to deal with it, rather than actually engaging with it.
It really riles people to be told that.
Yeah. And again, it's coming from a place of we've all been told that's an effect, you know, telling someone they're autistic. And I can go too far and I have to be careful the other way where I accidentally tell friends I think they might be. And that's also not okay for me to be kind of diagnosing people. I didn't see a barrier, you know.
I know exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I understand that. It's not something that you see as having a stigma or a negative connotation. Yeah.
And in part, I think because in entrepreneurship world, as my partner hates when I call it, startup land.
Startup land.
Yeah, it's so overrepresented compared to the population. And one of the things that Felicity spoke about is maybe it's just because we find it really hard to fit into other systems. We have to create our own.
I absolutely agree with that. I've worked in jobs with systems and felt so claustrophobic and confined and angry that these systems are working in a certain way. And I do think there is absolutely something in that it's about our ability to solve the problems in the way that we want to be able to do it, but also to create an environment that works for us. So if you typically think about you're working for an enterprise, whatever, the point where you might get an assistant will be the point where you're a senior manager or mid-level manager or something. Now, in order to get to that point, an assistant might typically help you with executive functioning issues, right? So organisation and reminders and diaries and how to get to places and various different things. Now, you're not going to get to that point unless you're actually able to manage some of that stuff by yourself anyway, at which point the assistant does something else. But as a founder, you get to have that assistant right from the start if you choose to have that.
I want to touch on that because I think it's something that I definitely felt. Getting an assistant and getting it, in my case, support worker. I felt like, oh, what am I going to do? Ask her to sort my M&Ms into colours for me. Who do I think I am? And I genuinely was like, I can't justify this. And it wasn't until I spoke to a few people, and I was honestly like not actually doing great when I got her. I had a baby burnout, and that was in part because life got big, but also because I just was trying to do a load of stuff that I just didn't. And I, you know, when that was my only job, fine. But when you're a founder, you have 20 jobs, and actually it was really taking a toll. But it took me way too long, not just because financially I was like, how do I justify this? But because I was like, how do I justify the fact that I have an assistant, you know, if I tell people. And I think we do need to, as well as like destigmatizing ADHD, autism, neurodivergence more broadly, we really need to destigmatize the help.
Absolutely. And I honestly think that's something that women suffer more for, because if you are ADHD or autistic, you will probably have a propensity towards perfectionism because we've been criticised in the past for not getting stuff right, but also because we have to work extra hard to do the things that we might not naturally be good at, right? So it feels like A, you're being arrogant, or B, that you've failed in some way. Yeah. And those things are not true, right? They are not true, because the one thing that I've said to neurodivergent people time and time again is the executive functioning bit is the bit you can outsource, right? So just get someone else to do it.
Part of the problem I think I found, executive function sounds a lot like chief executive.
Exactly. It's a weird word that doesn't make any sense.
When someone said to me, do you struggle with executive function? Like, what? Excuse you.
What does that mean? Yeah.
I am very executive functional.
I'm a great executive.
I am a chief executive functional, actually, I'll have you know. Yeah. And also to your point, I want to be careful because I know that there are some people who are much more affected by ADHD and actually I have more choice on some things that I will find easier. But I think also if you're getting a late diagnosis, it's because you've been good at masking it, right? Yeah. And so to a degree, this is the other thing that plays in your head, but I can do it. I can do it.
You can, but where is your energy best spent?
Exactly.
And that's the thing, is you get to a point where you're like, I can either be creative and forward-thinking and innovative and drive the business, or I can process invoices.
Oh my God.
And I can remember who I'm supposed to be invoicing. It's really obvious, right? Which one you should be doing.
And a friend really helpfully told me I also had to allocate, if I was doing an opportunity cost analysis, the hours I spend worrying about doing the invoices or correcting the things that go wrong.
And waking in the middle of the night and going, oh God.
Yeah. I may still do that.
I'm fine. Yeah, but you've got somebody you can send it to.
But 100%. And I think it's really remarkable. And actually my EA support worker actually has ADHD, but she is able to kind of switch on in a different role, and she enjoys making systems that mean she doesn't have to do something.
Yeah, and I think there is this thing that does happen, is that when you are bad at something, you work really hard at getting it well, and then you get good systems, which is another reason why women don't get diagnoses as often because they have built those systems in place because of our propensity to perfectionism, because of the way that society kind of brings up. So when people say, do you lose your keys? No, the reason I don't lose my keys is because I put them exactly the same place every night. So that's because you've built a strategy to do it. Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. I have this with kind of family who are like, I don't have ADHD and I write my Christmas meal to the minute plan on the fridge, and it's like, yeah, but why? Like, that's not normal.
Yeah, exactly. Some people can just do it without needing to. No, exactly. The biggest thing I say to people, because I've helped a lot of entrepreneurs and startup founders, is like, no shame.
Yeah.
There is no shame. It is just a thing. It's just a problem that needs to be solved. If this was in your business and you were talking to a colleague and someone was saying, like, it is just a thing that needs to be solved. So we just solve it. And how do we solve it? We solve it by getting support in where we need it. And if you think about schools, like good Senko departments in schools, i.e. departments that are there to support kids that have additional needs or need a bit of support, that's the role that they perform. If you go to a university, there are kind of often departments that help in there. So we should be just replicating that. We should be replicating this in our businesses, in our lives. Who's the person I go to when I need to get rid of a block, when I need support? Like, who is my Senko, you know?
And I think one of the things that's really surprised me about ADHD coaching, one of the biggest reframes has been, I don't just have to go through the hard stuff.
Yeah.
I have a real attitude, and I think in some parts of my life it serves me incredibly well, when there is just traumatic shit you've got to go through.
Yeah.
But there's a children's book that is quoted often in my family, which is called The Bear Hunt. And there's basically they're going on a bear.
We're going on a bear hunt.
We're going to have to. We're going to have a big one.
Oh,
we're not scared.
We're not scared.
And then they go through a succession of obstacles. And every time they get to an obstacle, eventually they say, can't go over it, can't go under it. Oh no, we'll have to go through it. Mud, a fence. They're quite low-key obstacles. Long grass. I mean, their lives are easy. Go catch a bear. I don't know why the long grass was such a scary obstacle. But anyway, but I think I have this attitude. And the tricky balance is founders often have this approach of, I can push through. And I think this is part of what I've been unlearning is like, okay, I'm really putting off a task. I'm perfectly capable. I'm doing my personal finances. Great example. I'm highly capable. I'm not someone who can't make an Excel sheet, can make financial models for startups. I can make a personal budget.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to do it because I didn't want the truth. And I knew it was going to be unpleasant. And I just was like, I don't want to know. So I actually went through what are my processing modalities. Big ones for me, emotional and verbal. So I suddenly realized I'm someone who processes a million times better with someone else. Yeah. I can have someone to bounce stuff off.
Yeah.
And also emotional support. Oh, if I do this task with a friend sat there, A, I get accountability. We've booked the time I need to actually do this task. B, it's just nicer.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of what I've been doing in my ADHD coach, how do I make this nicer?
Yeah.
Light a candle. Some of it's really basic and some of it's really hard. But actually, for me, the mindset shift has not been, how do I make myself do it? Because I thought going into ADHD, it was about how do I make myself concentrate?
Yeah.
How do I make my mind quieter? That's what I wanted to get out. If you asked me in the beginning, like, I want to make myself disciplined, follow through on things, not get distracted so much, and have a mind that is not so noisy because it's quite tiring being in here all the time.
Good luck with that, Hattie.
And I sadly realised that is not what ADHD coaching does. The first time I ever went to therapy, I said, I want you to put everything in my brain back in the boxes that they're leaking out of. And the therapist was like, that's not how this works.
My job.
So I'm really good at going to things with totally the wrong expectation.
But people do that because that's what they think it has to be solved. But it doesn't have to be solved. Yeah. As in, you are who you are. That is the things that are brilliant about you, things that you find challenging about yourself, all of those things.
Yeah.
You just have to go, okay, this is who I am. What do I need to do to make this the right thing for me to be able to operate and to work?
And I think one big thing for neurodiverse people is also actually praising yourself for the stuff you do when you're having the good, because all of these have good bits, right, as well. Yeah. Like, would I actually trade my distractibility for my hyper? Like, when I am high focus, the amount I get done at the level I get it done, I'm so proud of. I'm like,
and it's exciting in this phase. That's a really exciting zone to be in.
100%. And I've learned from trying to outsource work, the thing that will take me an hour when I'm in a good place takes someone else 2 days, and I'm going, what? Rattled it out.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't trade that for the times when I'm sat at my desk going, oh, I can't. I've done lots, but nothing that I meant to do.
Nothing of any worth.
Also, often worth something, but
not the thing I should have been
the
doing.
washing is clean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's not hung up.
Yeah.
It's in the washing machine.
Yeah.
There's a great list of things that they should actually ask on ADHD. Diagnosis, one of which is how many times does it take you to do the wash?
To do the how many rounds does it before it gets out?
I'm averaging 3.
It's so bad.
So bad.
Yeah.
So for founders, I think that there is this mindset shift of it doesn't need fixing.
Yeah.
How do I make it nicer? And how do I make it work for me ultimately? I think maybe is a better way of putting it. What do you think leaders who are listening to us and going, I don't relate to anything you're saying, I don't have those challenges, what should they be thinking about to design an organisation that is neuro-inclusive?
Research shows from a psychologist called Nancy Doyle, who runs an organisation called Genius Within. And Nancy Doyle suggests that up to 20% of us are neurodivergent. So if you're a leader in a business and you are running an organisation, it's likely that 20% of your employees are going to be neurodivergent, 20% of your customers, 20% of your clients, 20% of your family, 20% of your friends. So if you are not thinking about those people, you are ignoring a significant sector of people that you should be working with and thinking about. The stats around this are pretty extraordinary. There was some interesting research done by Tech Talent Charter, who did a really interesting report in diversity a few months ago. They're a kind of diversity organisation that work within tech. They think about diversity in all sorts of different areas. They looked at neurodiversity and they surveyed hundreds of tech companies, and they did some additional work in looking at employees of different tech companies. So their research showed that 53% of people who work in tech identify as neurodivergent, right? So 53%. When they asked the people who are running the businesses, the employers, what percentage of your workforce do you think is neurodivergent? The answer was 3%, right?
So we're just missing half.
Exactly. And why? Why are people...
It's just mad given the percentage that we know will be neurodivergent of the leaders, right? Because that's even higher.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the people who are the employers think that only 3% of their workforce is 3%, that the workforce is saying it's 53% of us, right? That is a massive problem because that sector, which is traditionally one that stereotypically might be attracting neurodivergent people, has got over half of the workforce saying we're neurodivergent, and yet they're not saying it. And there's a reason, and the reason is around stigma.
Yeah.
And so if you are a leader in one of those organisations, I'm sure we've got a lot of tech leaders that listen to this podcast, that's something you really need to be considering because those people will be burning out. They will be masking it and you're masking their behaviours in different ways. And if you look at the research that I think the National Autistic Society did around the number of autistic people that are looking to leave their jobs, that was around 50% as well. It's a huge issue in terms of attrition, not just recruitment, but keeping people comfortable in their jobs. You absolutely have to be thinking about it.
Well, right. Like if you're constantly...
Oh my God, yeah.
And also just even little things like I remember my old company, the standing joke like, Hattie, you're so bad at proofreading.
Yeah.
I'm awful.
But so what?
Awful. This is it.
So
I don't
what?
need to be good at
You don't need to, exactly.
And actually I think as a founder, this is a side note, but as a founder, I think what does become tricky is you might know you're bad at some of these things, you might not have the people to support you. And so how can you draw on your network to support you? And so a little example, actually she's come on the podcast, absolute babe, Nat from Future Kind Collective. I still remember this really vividly. I was ill. I think I had COVID or something. I wasn't really feeling pants. And I had a proposal that had to go out to a client that day. No one on my team I could hand it over to at this point. It was just me and the org. I was chatting to Nat about something else. I just said, I'm feeling really ill. And she said, how can I help? And I was like, oh, don't worry, I've just got to do this proposal. Do you want me to sense check it for you? Why don't I read it when you're done?
Yeah.
Just to help have another pair of eyes on it. And I'll do a proof while I'm there.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think little things, as you say, taking away the personal shame as well as the broader stigma.
Yeah.
So that you can be like, oh, I don't need to be good
You don't, exactly. And that is where the beauty in the neurodivergent teams that I've run and the neurodivergent organisations is the absolute beauty comes when people can say, do you know what? I just can't write this email. I just can't do it. And you're like, oh, that's fine. Okay, let me help you. And it's just about moving those blockers, removing them, and just having those moments, and there being no judgment on it, there being no kind of view on it. It's just a problem. It's just a problem to be solved.
And I wish I'd known more about this earlier, because even that example, I had a colleague who notoriously I used to mock shamelessly, because I'd be like, why is it taking you 2 hours for an email? And see, it would take him 2 hours. And at various points, I was like, I'll just write it for you, because it would take me 2 minutes. What do you want to say? Done. And actually, it would have been nicer if I'd been like, hey, you're struggling with this.
Yeah.
How do we stop you having to do that? Because it's such, not an unsenior person, it was terrible use of their time.
Yeah, to sit for 2 hours waiting to do it.
Not waiting, doing it.
Or just literally doing it.
And I was just like, I couldn't conceive, because to me that was a 2-minute task.
Yeah.
And I think there is a bit of the ADHD impatience, like, why is it taking you so long? Just friggin' send it already. But I didn't have the empathy, right? To be like, hey, this is a task you find really hard.
But it's, I understand, but we've all done that.
Yeah.
We've all done that stuff, right? That is just life. But we just need to get to a point where it is empathy, but it's also just a thing.
Yeah.
So the empathy, it is really important. Like, it is important, but it also is just getting to a point. I'm stuck. I need a thing. There's the thing, and then it's done.
Doesn't
right?
require a big, I understand.
Exactly.
You're struggling with this.
how am I just...
let's go on with it.
Exactly. Right, I can help you. It's a practical, like, blah, 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 blah. And that's where it worked best for me, is that people would come and say stuff and go, blah, blah, blah. I would go to someone and say, I'm stuck on a thing. Can I talk it out with you? 5-minute talk.
We've had this,
done.
right? Well, we've done it, and it's, you say, can we actually have...
Yeah, exactly.
Can we have 5 minutes?
Yeah.
And we did it, and
it just
pro 3.
It does it. And it's really hard doing that as a solo founder.
Yeah.
If you're not a solo founder, you're doing it with a co-founder, or you're running a kind of team, just getting to a point where that stuff becomes normal is brilliant, because there is a thing within, particularly within autism, again, I notice it in ADHD, called perseverance, which is having to know absolutely everything before you can move on with something, right? So it's often why autistic people will ask continuous questions before they can move on with something. So I describe it as like Kaplunk, right? The game Kaplunk. So the game with Kaplunk is like, it's in a cylinder. There's lots of cocktail sticks in the cylinder and marbles.
Yeah.
And you have to pull the cocktail sticks out without the marbles coming down. But I think about it like, often the thing that we're trying to do is like the marbles at the top of Kaplunk, right? And you have to remove just the little blocks, and then it's fine.
Yeah.
Right? Those things have to be lined up and have to be in the right place to do it. But no shame, I can get to that goal. I can do it. I just need these things removing.
So final few minutes, picking up on the shame thread. What are some of the most common, I don't want to ask, no's that people have told you when you've offered this little series on LinkedIn?
So the series that I do on LinkedIn is, you can ask me anything about neurodiversity and I won't get offended. And I get asked all sorts of questions. So typically people will ask me to say, am I autistic or ADHD? And I always say...
As in, are you?
No, are they autistic or ADHD? They will, and I can't do that. But people will be interested in whether a particular trait is autistic or ADHD. A lot of stuff around partners. I think my partner might be. What do I do about this? A lot of stuff. I get a lot of questions from autistic people because I've worked a lot with autistic people. I've got autistic family members, so I feel quite sort of connected with it. But a lot of people ask me to translate for them. So people will approach me and say, I've been told this and I don't understand what it means. Can you help me to work out what someone's actually saying here? It's really hard to describe how difficult that can be for autistic people, that understanding tone of voice or reading body language, understanding unwritten social rules. So I get asked a lot to translate. I get asked a lot by people, when can I tell? And this is an example of a question that typically someone would get offended by, but I think it's really important to be addressing this stuff. My son is autistic or my colleague is autistic. When can I tell? When does the autism end and the bad behaviour begin? Yeah, that's a hard question to answer, and I genuinely don't mind people answering it because I asked it a lot, but it is in its nature could be offensive to somebody who was asked that question. But it's the sense that people feel that autism or ADHD is sort of separate, or sometimes an excuse, but it's an extra thing that people carry. And actually, it's just there is no end to the autism or the ADHD. It's essentially part of someone's being. It's their identity. It's like being gay. It's like being a woman. It's a part of your identity. So if someone is behaving in a way that is upsetting other people or so on, of course you have to manage it and deal with it, but you can't ignore it. I mean, you might choose to make allowances or explain things in a different way or understand that's coming from a different point of view. So typically, a lot of the stuff that I will get asked is this autistic person is behaving in this particular way. And I'm like, do you understand that's not what they're actually doing or saying? You need to understand that this is where that's coming from. And then it's kind of like a change of the
mind a bit.
Exactly.
It's a bit like
exactly.
ADHD interruption, right?
Yeah, totally.
You drive my partner up the wall because he finds it really rude. The interruption for him is like, that's a rude thing to do, right? If someone's mid-flow and you interrupt them with something totally different and then you take the conversation with someone else, that's actually quite rude.
Yeah.
All my friends have ADHD, basically. So for us, we're like, and to us, that's not rude. That's super engagement, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's like, I'm in it. I'm here, and I'm like, and I'm moving it on to this bit because this is like an exciting way to go. And,
and I do want to be told when that's coming across as rude. But what I also need the person to understand is like, hey, that's not where that's coming. You think it's, I want to talk about something else.
Yeah.
That's not quite what this is.
Yeah.
I have a responsibility for my behaviour as well to be able to regulate some of that so that actually, if I get distracted, I am bring it back to you because actually it matters to you that we've finished this conversation. You have needs in this as well. But I think some of that understanding point actually changes the discussion.
The conversation has to move away from how can neurodivergent people adapt their behaviour.
Yeah.
Right? There is a responsibility, right? You are responsible if you communicate something in a certain way, you've upset someone, that is your responsibility whether you meant it or not, right? But we have to move away from it being entirely the neurodivergent person's responsibility. And this concept is something called double empathy, which is a new kind of concept which is coming up from research, which is the understanding that it's actually mainly based in autism, but I think it relates to all sorts of different types of people, is that autistic people have a particular way of communicating. People who aren't autistic have another way of communicating. Sometimes those things don't meet. So typically research shows that autistic people will have no problem communicating with other autistic people, and non-autistic people have no problem communicating with non-autistic people. So actually the issue is in the combination of the two, and it requires understanding and change and compromise on both of those parts. So a very typical thing that happens with autism is that people who are autistic might talk in a very direct way, perceived as being rude or questioning or not looking at authority. But actually that's absolutely not the case. It's often that questioning or the directness is about needing a particular way of understanding. And if you understand that someone is asking you a lot of questions, but understand that isn't about challenging you, it's just about helping their understanding, it completely reframes the whole thing.
Yeah. I think there's some interesting cultural stuff that comes in there as well, right? Where some cultures are very happy being direct. English, not one of those. And I'm definitely guilty of being like, oh, if someone says something outright, they must be attacking. It's almost like, oh, I'm now feeling defensive because you asked the question. Actually, the question didn't require any defensiveness from me. It just question.
Yeah, absolutely. People who are ADHD, often very prone to rejection sensitivity, right? The biggest lesson I have learned, and I have got a lot more what you would call thicker skinned. So I was like, I'm not thick skinned enough. Why am I prone to this rejection? Why do I feel this way? Is I worked with autistic people with very direct styles of communication that was really hard for me because my rejection sensitivity is like, what have I done wrong? What's this? What's that? And then I realised that wasn't the case. It's just a way of talking. Ignore this tone of voice. Listen to the content of what's actually being said. And it's really transformed my relationships with so many people.
Yeah. I really like this idea of double empathy.
Yeah.
We have to finish. So I have two final questions before we go. Two quick fires. First quick fire question.
Yeah.
What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Yep. So the best piece of advice I have ever received is don't take criticism from people you wouldn't take advice from.
I love it. So good.
Yep.
Final question. What is the thing you're proudest of?
Right. So can I have two?
Sasha's prepped for this. I can tell when guests read my briefing guide because Sasha is ready.
On it.
You can have two.
Thank you. Well, even if you'd said I couldn't, I would have taken two anyway. The first is about a company. I didn't do particularly well at school. I didn't go to university. It's always been a thing that I felt uncomfortable with. And last year, I stood on stage at King's pitching my business to 500 people alongside 20 other entrepreneurs, and we'd all been selected for being the best companies to have come out of university accelerators because my business partner at the time had come out of UCL, and they were deep tech companies and Imperial and LSE, and I just had a moment where I went, oh, this feels really good. So that was a really proud moment for me. Yeah. The other proud moment for me, if I allow the other one, is the work that I've done with young people and the ability to think and how you can change someone's life while still running a business and still doing that. So I remember one of the proudest moments was a young person I was working with who wasn't able to leave the house, and being involved in him making it into school and building his confidence was really wonderful. And it's just that it was a real reminder for me and to all entrepreneurs out there, is like that contact with your users, or whoever your users in this particular context is a difficult word, but that engagement with your users, it's what drives us. It gives us our reason. It makes us what we are. Don't ever lose it, because that pride you feel about making a change in someone's lives is like, can't be beaten.
Love that one note to end on. Sasha, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, I've loved it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Before you go, please do take a minute to follow so you never miss another episode. We have some incredible founders coming up. And I always love to hear what resonates with listeners. So do drop us a direct message on Instagram @NotMyFirstGuest with any moments that meant something to you, ideas for future episodes, or your own entrepreneurial stories you want to share. Until next time, happy startupping.